Earth, 2017. This wasn't her world, and that was the only thing she knew. Not who she was or how she'd wound up kneeling against dry, cracked desert ground, wind peppering her skin in a stinging spray of dust. The blue sky stretching above her looked absurd, like something she'd seen in pictures but never in real life. It all felt so foreign. Foreign, but not unknown. A boom exploded above her, and she threw herself to the ground, covering her head. Jets swooped overhead. How long had she been here for the military to find her? Her clothes held only a thin layer of sand. So, not long. Minutes. Or else she'd be plastered in debris from the wind. This must have been a restricted area for them to have found her so quickly. Why here? Why was she in a restricted area on an alien planet? And how was it that trying to remember her own name felt like falling through a bottomless pit? But information about the military poured easily through her mind. She wanted to cry, but didn't allow herself. She knew how to control her emotions, even when she was totally and utterly panicked. Compartmentalize. Set the feelings aside and think only about survival. That didn't seem normal or healthy. Who was she? She dared to look around. Directly behind her, a huge round pod sank into the ground with its metal door wide open. Well, shit. This really must not have been her world. Rumbling sounded from the distance. The jets were circling, sun glinting off them, and soon dozens of military jeeps drove over the hazy curve of barren land, surrounding her. She succumbed to the dizziness and rolled onto her side, so heavy. That didn't feel right. Maybe the gravity was stronger than where she came from. How terrifying. But she couldn't feel the fear even as she tried to, as if she'd split into two, and this piece of her could only observe the tremble in her fingers without trembling herself. The sensation didn't feel new. So familiar. Her life was quickly becoming those two dichotomies. Familiar and not. The jeeps kicked dust into the air and slammed to a stop in a barricade around her. Soldiers rushed out, pointing guns at her. These were things she knew. The list was small but growing. Like that, she didn't recognize the sky as her own, and yet she recognized the soldiers' fatigues as that of the United States Army. Or that she knew the soldiers now shouting unintelligibly at her were aiming M4S. She struggled to her knees and then her feet, the fear finally exploding into something she could feel. Energy tightening her muscles so she could run, if only there were somewhere to flee to. Get down! Down on the ground! One voice broke through the others. An older man climbed out of one of the vehicles and motioned at the others. The soldiers fell to silence while the officer pointed his pistol at her. On the ground now! He nodded at another man who pointed at her, and then dropped down to his stomach, fingers laced behind his head, showing her. I speak English, she said as she lowered slowly to her knees. News to her as well. Shocking news. Gasps crackled through the silence of the crowd. Maybe she should have kept this newly discovered fact to herself, but she'd blurted it out before she could stop herself. All the way down, the officer said. Anger hardened his voice, but it was fear she saw in his eyes. Only once she'd flattened completely did the man speak again. Who are you? He wouldn't like her answer. His voice raised. Who? I don't know. Excuse me? She closed her eyes, tears squeezing free. I don't know who I am. I don't know why I'm here. Her heart pounded as both the fury and fear sharpened on his face. She didn't know anything that mattered. Cold cuffs dug into her wrists in the brightly lit room. She kept her head low, searching her memory for any hint that could help her explain to the gun-wielding soldiers why she was here. People covered head to toe in bulky blue suits had taken blood samples, cut square pieces from her clothes, swabbed her cheeks and beneath her nails. Hours passed, and still she had no new answers. Windows encased the room they'd kept her in, and there was an airlock outside the door. Undoubtedly, they worried about any contamination she could bring to this facility and the people inside it. She glanced at her reflection in the window. It was faint, but she couldn't deny the evidence that she looked just like these people from Earth, except for maybe her bronze eyes. No one else she'd seen had her color exactly, though some were close enough. Questions flooded her mind. Of the few things she knew about herself, she knew this. Not having answers killed her. By the time another hiss from the airlock came, her throat was dry and body fatigued. A new man entered, followed by 4 more men and women. They all wore the blue protective suits, but while the others who had come to take samples from her had white coats beneath theirs, these people wore dark business suits. They all took a seat across the table from her. The distance felt far, because she was all alone. She didn't even have her own mind to keep her company. Her memories, her life, were locked deep away where she couldn't reach it. The man at the head of the table spoke first. I'm General Price. Then he slid something along the table to her. A thin, golden bracelet skidded to a stop in front of her. She leaned forward and tilted her head. A little oval piece connected the chains with a name engraved on it. Rory. Her throat felt swollen. What is this? You tell me. He studied her with his hands folded on the table and stare unwavering. It was the only thing we found in the craft you arrived in. Broken, lying on the floor. I don't know. I hear that's the only thing you seem to know how to say. Rather convenient. It isn't convenient. She clenched her teeth together and shook her head. Having no answers when there's dozens of guns in your face isn't convenient. It is if those wielding the guns wouldn't like your answers. All the people were watching her. She shifted, readjusting her cuffed wrists. What did your tests show? He held her eyes for a beat. What do you think they showed? Fear tightened her voice. That I'm not one of you. That. It sounded insane saying this, but not as insane as coming to in a desert with no memory and what appeared to be a spacecraft behind her. This isn't my world. General Price had exuded confidence since he'd entered, but she caught the hint of trepidation in his words when he spoke this time. Your blood, your DNA, your clothes, and your spacecraft are unique from anything else on Earth. She gasped in a breath. Knowing it and having it confirmed hit her differently. I'm telling the truth when I say I can't remember anything, not even my own name. She gestured at the bracelet. I don't know if that's my name or someone I left behind. I don't know why it's written in your language. What about your own language? Could you speak to us or write in your own language? It occurred to her that not only did she know English, but that she'd been thinking in English, and the thought of her own language made her nervous. Lumivra exquilara zenthrisht. Another beat of quiet. The general's voice sounded hollow. What does it mean? I do not know myself. The general looked at a woman who sat beside him. She passed a notepad to him. The two took turns writing something too far away to see, and then they returned their attention to her. The general cleared his throat. We have questions which need to be answered. Questions of the utmost importance to national security. We need you to try to answer them. I'll try. How do you know English? She shook her head. Why is your biology so similar to ours? Is it? She leaned forward and caught on the restraints. We look alike. But what about the blood, the DNA? How similar are we? How did your spacecraft enter our airspace undetected until the final moments before it landed? I don't know. She hung her head. What do you want from us? I want answers. You know more than I do at this point. I know. I know you don't believe me, but it's true. A sudden sob shook her shoulders, and she lowered her head to the table, trying to hide from them when she had no way to. The fatigue had worn down the wall, separating her from her emotions. I don't know myself. Her hands felt numb as she wrote the sounds of her language and transliterated them into English. Her alphabet worked differently than theirs, more like Mandarin, though still distinct. And that had led her to a new fact about herself. There were two Earth languages she knew, English and Mandarin. Fascinating, terrifying. No others were coming to her mind. It was strange to learn about herself along with the others, as though she too were an observer, a scientist studying her own life. She felt disconnected from her body as she wrote, as though she'd vanished, and didn't know where she'd gone, only that she could distantly feel this body she'd left behind. Derealization. The scientists would call it that. The word floated across her mind, something she caught out in the wild of her amnesia. Rory. She glanced up. They'd started calling her that, and it felt right somehow. Felt like she wanted to call herself that as well. Hearing him say it made her see the person beneath the white coat. Was he scared too? You speak English and Mandarin fluently. Do you remember speaking to anyone else like you in these languages? People constantly filtered in and out of the room, stood at the windows and watched. I don't remember that either, but I have some impressions. There's no memory to back it up, only that these languages have become as familiar to me as my own. Do you have the impression that you've been in the United States before? No, it doesn't feel familiar. It doesn't feel like home. What does home feel like? I can't remember. Just not like this. The air doesn't feel like this. She wrapped her arms around herself. They'd given her longer chains for her restraints, so she could reach the paper and crayon. Something told her that crayons were for children, and they were afraid to give her anything sharp to write with. Smart. She didn't even know what she was capable of. I have other impressions. Her voice sounded small. She met this man's hazel eyes and saw him beneath the sameness he shared with the others. Saw the person sitting beside her, terrified and curious. I don't want to hurt any of you. I don't want to make you feel afraid. His mouth was open, but he didn't speak. I want to be honest. Do you have any impressions on why you're here? Rory shook her head. I wish I did. I keep thinking about it. She chuckled. It's all I think about. Maybe I was sent to make contact with you, but something went wrong on the journey and wiped my memory. But why send me in person? Why not communicate remotely? I could be killed at any time. It's risky. He tilted his head. Rory waited for one of the higher-ups she knew always watched to silence them. This man was just a scientist. She doubted he was supposed to have this conversation with her, but that was what made it feel safe. real. Maybe I was escaping. Maybe this was my only chance of survival. Do you feel like you're on the run? I feel. Rory closed her eyes and searched for words to capture the mysteries within her, the crushing heartache, and the longing for what she didn't know. I feel like everything has been stripped from me. My name, whoever I once loved, my own language. Tears slid down her cheeks. It feels like I've been losing things for a very long time, that this heaviness in my chest isn't new, that I am powerless and frightened. He was leaning toward her the first time anyone had. Wasn't this why she'd talked? He'd met her eyes when they spoke like he was actually looking at her and not just studying her. She hadn't realized it until now, but there was a reason she chose him to speak to. I know. Rory's voice sobered. I know there's a reason I have all this knowledge of Earth, and that I do not want to hurt you. His voice was low, like it was meant for her, and not everyone who watched. Does someone else want to hurt us? The question pried open a new source of terror in her, because she did care for this world. She could feel the care making her afraid not for just herself, but for them. I don't think I was sent to hurt you. You were sent. A headache pounded at her temples. She shook her head. I don't know. I'm sorry. I just don't know. The crawl of time might have driven Rory insane if the scientists hadn't started bringing in objects for her to test, to see what was familiar or foreign to her, what she knew how to use or didn't. She could find no thread connecting what felt familiar to her hands and what didn't. The paintbrush did. The laptop didn't. She had some difficulty adjusting the microscope they'd brought, like she didn't know the equipment, but she knew how to handle the slides, and the bacteria she saw buzzing around had names in her mind. E. coli. Gross. Not something she wanted to touch. Could it be that she was a scientist? That had started to feel likely until they brought in the replica of the Glock G19, and her hands knew it so well that suddenly, for the first time, she felt as if she touched a piece of home. Rory held the gun stiffly, hiding how comfortable she felt with it, and that if they asked her to clean it, or load it, or shoot it, she'd enjoy it enough to find it all calming. Why the fuck did she know how to handle American guns? Until now, she'd been honest, but she knew to keep this to herself. For now, at least. They would never trust her if they feared her, and if she was here because they were in danger, she couldn't help them if they thought she'd come to turn their own weapons on them. Plus, she really wanted to survive this. The man she'd spoken to before returned with musical instruments. She shook her head as she ran her fingers along the sharp chords of a guitar. I don't play music. I don't feel like I have any idea of what to do with these, but I do know what they are. The man picked up the guitar. Do you sing? He strummed the guitar, his bulky gloves pressing clumsily so that the sounds clashed. They both smiled and Rory winced. He hopped up with the instrument, exited to the airlock, and pulled off his gloves. You sing, and I'll follow your lead. A uniformed officer looked at him skeptically, but didn't interfere. Rory glanced around at everyone watching. I don't want to sing. Music is life. Your people have music. We could learn so much about you by hearing it. She swallowed hard and looked down. A song came to her, one that squeezed her chest and made her ache for the home she couldn't remember. I'll sing it in English. Her voice came out raspy, but it didn't sound bad. In fact, it felt very natural. Sleep. In our arms. The scientist watched her. The fear from earlier melted away, and the curiosity softening into something more like wonder. The leftovers of a smile clung, softening his expression and his eyes. Sleep, sweet baby. As she came around to repeat the words, he played his guitar with her now, complimenting her as if he'd heard the song before. Pain seized her heart, as visceral as a heart attack. The words cut off and she bit her lip. In the midst of the suffering, she watched herself like a cruelly distant observer and wondered about her reaction. Had her mother sang it to her? Or had Rory sang it to her own child? Did she have a baby back home waiting for her? Maybe a little brother or sister even. She tried to feel which it was, but the pain overcame her and she sank against the table, crying so hard she couldn't breathe. The song had crushed the wall inside her, so the bricks were pulverized and she couldn't hold back the tsunami of grief. The airlock opened and the scientist rushed for her, until suddenly he stopped. No one could get close to her. She tried to wrap her arms around herself, but her cuffs caught. It had just been a song. But that scientist was right. Music was life, and the simple tones had swept her close enough to a life she couldn't remember to feel its waters lap against her toes. And it was too much to bear. Rory loved people back home, people whose names and faces had been stolen from her mind, pried from her fingers. The loss was too great to even try to figure out who it was she missed. Because as she wept like a child, horrified by her weakness, humiliated by the display of emotion, unable to control herself, the pain was so great that she could not face it long enough to search for the ones she loved buried in this suffering. Rory wept until she could no longer utter a sound. She stared at the overbearing medical equipment lining the room. It was her first time leaving her holding room in almost a week, but somehow, this didn't seem like it would be much better than sitting in that room. My name is Dr. Johansson. I'm here to do testing. First, we'll need you to sign some consent forms. The doctor offered a smile. Rory snorted. Really? I have rights? As far as I'm concerned, yes. You have rights. If there's anything you don't feel comfortable with, let me know. We'll stop. Comfort soothed the hurt in her heart. This was some of the only control she'd had since coming to in the desert. What do you need to do? We'd like to do a full physical examination and undergo some imaging. It will help us learn more about your biology and your history. Rory straightened. Like if I've had any injuries or surgeries? Yes. Do everything. Anything that could give me answers. The doctor's expression softened. You really don't remember. Rory shook her head. The fear of not knowing never left, never even slightly abated. It had become a permanent weight hanging from her chest that she had to lug around with every step, struggle against for each breath. But the grief sometimes ballooned into something she struggled to control. Could you tell if I've had a child? The words shocked them both. It had just come out of Rory's mouth. Do you think you have? I remembered a lullaby. I don't know if my mother sang it to me, or if I sang it to a baby. The doctor nodded. Our biology is so similar. We may be able to tell. For most women, there are discernible signs of childbirth or even miscarriage. Rory moved to the exam table, more than ready for answers. I'm sorry it took me so long to return to you. The general wanted his briefing first. The kind doctor sat close to Rory in the holding room, rather than on the far side of the table. She opened a manila folder, and when she spoke, her voice was soft. I did not find any indication of childbirth. From what I've seen, your reproductive biology is identical to ours, and I would be very surprised if you had ever delivered a baby. Oh, Rory nodded and then smiled. Was she saddened or relieved? Surprised? Her emotions felt too distant now to catch and parse. Thank you. It's possible you could have been pregnant and not carried to term. I see no evidence of that, but an early loss often leaves no scars or long-term changes. A loss. She felt as if she had lost so much. Could it have been a child? She would never know, not unless her memories returned to her. Thank you for telling me that first. I'm an expert in forensic medicine, so while some of what I will share is my best estimate, it is a very good one. The doctor met her eyes. I believe you're in your mid-20s. You're in very good health with no known conditions. I did see evidence of a broken femur that looked to heal well as some scarring along your ribs. She motioned along her own in a swath along the right side. I believe these were from different incidents. The ribs looked to be older injuries. If she'd trained with guns, who knew what other training she might have engaged in? It made sense that she'd have some old injuries. Surgeries? Not that I could tell. Now, we don't know how advanced your people are. It could be that they have much less invasive treatments than we do here. Thank you for sharing this with me. You know, like I'm a patient, not a specimen. You are a patient. I will be overseeing all medical care from here on out. She leaned in, voice quiet. I will know if anything is wrong medically. My patients are my top priority. Tears warmed Rory's eyes. She had to look down to hide them. Had the doctor just promised to protect her? You're a good person, Dr. Johansson. Just a person, Rory. Like you. Now you ask for me if you need anything at all that I can help with. I'm going to leave this file with you so that you can read through all the findings in detail. I'll check in tomorrow to see if you have questions. Time passed so slowly, not only because Rory was trapped in a room with no daylight, but also because her entire known life stretched from the beginning of the short time in the desert to now. Her mind had gone numb from the constant testing of all kinds, psychological, medical, technical, linguistic, cultural. Still, Rory's memories had not returned. It's puzzling how similar you are to us. It was the scientist who had played the guitar. She hadn't seen him all week, but he'd returned today for an interview. What's your name? She met his kind eyes. It's strange not knowing what to call the people I see more than once. Theo. He looked over his glasses at her. Short for Theodore. Theo. Rory smiled. I like that. I've thought about this too, how similar we are. She sat back against her chair. We must have a shared origin. You may be our origin. Your people may have planted life on Earth, or our worlds may have been seeded by the same civilization. We have a strong fossil record on Earth. If we were seeded, then it doesn't seem likely it was as humans. He pushed his glasses up, animated now. We had a time in our history where a huge and varied number of species exploded into the world. The Cambrian explosion. It's possible that someone seeded those species, and humans evolved from that. Then how are we so similar? There should be more differences between us if we evolved from other species in our worlds, since our worlds are different. It would seem that question likely has the same answer as to how you know English and Mandarin. Her chest tightened. This isn't the Earth's first contact. Your evolution was guided, but it wouldn't have been by my people. Look at me. She lifted her hand. We're of a similar developmental level. That civilization must have evolved beyond our forms. They'd be more than human by now if their technology is so advanced. He nodded. It's as if your world and mine are the children of a parent civilization. So how did a child find her way here? With nothing? Not even her memory? The general hopes you'll get me to answer this. Rory smiled. He's given up on interviewing me himself. You want to know the truth. I believe you when you say that. We had that breakthrough with the music together. I asked to be the one to do this interview. I think if we just talk, we'll learn more than if you're interrogated. Rory rubbed her arm. Do you believe me? That I have no memories? Theo nodded, eyes serious. I do. There's no signs of manipulation in your psychological tests or in the transcripts of your conversations. There just isn't evidence to support that you're lying, Rory. The military cannot afford to believe you. I can. Are you manipulating me, Theo? His eyes lingered, and then he smiled. That's not my strength. If I was a good manipulator, I would have had many more friends growing up. She chuckled. Fair enough. Her smile fell. Either I was sent here or I fled here. Those both seem like frightening options. The national security implications are critical. The United States is preparing for worst-case scenarios. It didn't seem like that was good news for her. I would never bring someone here to hurt your world. If there are people out there who have been around long enough to guide the evolution of two worlds, then I don't think you had a say in any of this. Why would they send me with nothing? She shook her head. It doesn't make sense. I must have escaped here. But if that's true, that pain hanging in her chest sharpened. She touched her heart. My people may already be gone. Theo reached forward and took her wrist. I'm sorry, Rory. I'm sorry this is happening to you. Her breath caught at his touch. It was the first time anyone had made contact with her other than for a test. She grabbed his hand and lowered her head, hating to show her weakness. I'm sorry too. I've upended your world. 3 weeks, and Rory had found a strange rhythm to this new life. They'd started allowing her time outside beneath their strange blue sky in a more comfortable bed. But she was still confined to the holding room other than when she was fortunate enough to go for a walk. But today, that would change. If I pass this test, I get more freedom? The general sat at the far end of the table, surrounded by advisors and scientists. Theo sat 2 seats down from Rory, a friendly face in a room that was always too stoic. We'll be conducting tests and observation for a great deal longer. We realize you need better accommodations. Perhaps an environment that feels more like home would even help you regain some memories. He believed her, didn't he? It was the first time Rory had felt so certain. What's the test? Theo looked up at the general, the curiosity that Rory so often saw in his eyes stronger now. He didn't know either. The general spoke with too level of a voice. We have enlisted help from specialists in the military for one last interrogation. Oh. Rory seemed to digest what he said before others at the table did. It was like the air was getting sucked out of each person, one by one. A familiar scientist pushed back from the table. Wait, she said. Theo spoke with a heavy voice. You want to torture her? Enhanced interrogation. The general kept his head up. Theo snorted and shook his head. Enhanced interrogation. He slammed his palm on the table, rattling Rory. That's the bullshit line you run through Congress. Have enough respect to be honest in front of the woman you're about to torture. Shock flooded her. This emotion from Theo was real, and he didn't seem the type to speak up. One of the advisors leaned in to whisper to him, but he brushed off the man's words. Rory is telling the truth. Theo rose from the table. Every test indicates so. Then this test will support the conclusion of the rest. The general looked sad as he averted his eyes from Rory. Theo's voice wavered on out of control. Dr. Johansson is welcome to resign. The general met Rory's eyes again. You've cooperated with us. You seem genuine. This could all be part of your ploy, but I feel I owe you the truth. Fear tightened her chest. Theo turned away, one hand running through his hair, the other clenched into a fist at his side. Voices clashed now, erupting and spewing like venom. Disagreements over the ineffectiveness of the methods and denials that it was torture at all. It all melted into one awful scream in Rory's mind. Until finally, she was the one to stand. Enough. They all spoke over her. Enough, she shouted this time. It felt good to unleash some emotion and take control for once. Everyone snapped to silence. She clenched her jaw. If you're doing it, then shut up about it and get it over with. Rory looked to Theo. It doesn't matter what's right or wrong. This was always going to happen because they're scared and have too much power and make stupid decisions. He has his orders. Look at him. He doesn't agree, but he'll do it anyway. So don't subject me to the torture of hearing you all yell about it. Rory. She plastered her hands on the table. I'm the greatest national security threat the United States has ever faced. The greatest existential threat to the entire world. She locked eyes on the general now, holding his stare. For now. If something dangerous is out there, you better hope they don't care about what you do to me. She rose back to her full height, looking from one person to the next. If you're doing it, get it over with. And when we're done, I expect to have a room with a view. Silence suffocated the air. Rory had lost track of time. General Price pressed a wet cloth to her forehead and pushed her hair back from her face. It was his first time coming to see her since the interrogation began. I'm sorry, Rory. His voice was heavy. Her vision swam. She'd expected something different than drugs and disorientingly loud music, like physical pain. Strangely, Rory thought she might have been better equipped for that. The unsettling feeling of the medication gave her the chills. All she could think about was how she told them to get it over with. What kind of person would react the way she had? Familiar. Rory knew suffering, and she knew not to expect anyone to show her mercy. But why? She hated being a mystery to herself. Fire ran through her veins, rushing into her from the IV hanging over her head. The general had turned off the awful music that had played on repeat and dimmed the harsh overhead lights. But her heart was still pounding out of her chest, and her thoughts were hard to catch. The drugs had stolen her mind from her. What little of her mind she had, at least. At some point, she'd realized they were trying to keep her from being able to lie and track the lies. All the details they asked, the way they rephrased the same questions, and did so with her under the influence, seemed like they wanted to catch her red-handed. Rory wasn't lying, though. Did you remember anything? He asked. She'd apparently trained with their guns, but that would not lessen her suffering to say. No. Rory met the general's eyes, searching for truth, because she had so few places to look for it. The way you've handled yourself is reminiscent of someone who's been interrogated before, or trained to resist it. I don't understand any of this. Sobs that she couldn't release thickened her voice. I'm broken into pieces that don't fit together. You've studied Earth and you're experienced with interrogation. Yet you're here alone with nothing at your disposal. It's seemingly more and more likely that you're a refugee. But the alternative, that you're a trained specialist, worries me. Me too. Crazy enough, it did worry her. This wasn't her planet, but it was full of people who didn't deserve what could be coming. It's almost over. The general heaved a heavy sigh and rose. I'm sorry, Rory. I really am. We truly are just children. Her voice cracked. We beat each other with sticks. Such nonsense. I wonder if we learned from our parents, or if they grew past our ways. She thought he was going to speak again, but he only turned and left her alone in this room. Left her broken beneath the weight of more pain than she could comprehend. All she'd ever known and loved was lost. Rory was lost. Muffled noises roused Rory from her sleep. The fire didn't fill her veins. Was it over? Hope touched the hurt places in her heart. Such a frightening thing to feel. Hope when broken hurt worse than anything else ever could. Rory. A voice she knew. A smile crawled onto her face. Theo. Fingers brushed her wrists. She managed to open her eyes to see him struggling to unlock the cuffs. Dr. Johansson stood behind him, looking shaken beneath her calm facade. What are you doing here? Rory asked. We insisted. Theo had her free now. They're done with you. We're taking you to your new home. Home. Rory moaned the word. Nothing had ever sounded weirder. Theo put his arm behind her to help her when two soldiers approached, but he only glared. Stay away from her. The doctor helped Theo lift her. We've got you now, Rory. She met Theo's eyes as he held her close and turned for the wheelchair nearby. Having someone hold her, even for a moment, felt incredible, like home wrapping around her and soothing her soul. Together, Dr. Johansson and Theo wheeled her out into the hallway and through the building. I don't know your first name. Rory watched the doctor, too tired to smile again, even though she wanted to. It's Christine, honey. Christine. Her eyes slid shut. Theodore. Consciousness nearly drifted away. My only two friends on Earth. Rory's ordeal had bought her windows that opened to the outside. It bought her 3 rooms and a kitchenette. It bought a fenced-in area outside. As much as she wanted to shun happiness after the price she'd paid for such basic luxuries, this was all Rory had, and it flooded her with joy. After all that time in the room where people stared at her constantly, it was such a thrill just to look at the sky or watch the wind kick up dust. Had she always been enthralled by simple things? Or was her life just this pathetic now? It was hard to say where things went from here. While they gave her such little information, her sense told her that the government would be preparing for every contingency and that they'd never let her out of their captivity. How could they? Rory's world had shrank down to a few rooms in a military complex. She longed to stretch the limits of these walls surrounding her, to push and find a way beyond them. No, not physically. She had no plans to run. Crazy enough, she didn't even want to. Of all the things that didn't make sense, that had to be up there. Rory was content in captivity. What the hell did that say about her? Maybe it was because she was so afraid for this world. Breathing in deeply, she fell back on the bench that she'd moved to the window and closed her eyes. Testing remained a daily ritual. Only life had begun to squeeze its way into the clinical, especially when Theo came. All of their conversations were monitored and recorded. Rory knew that. But talking to him and Christine felt real. The doctor couldn't visit often, but Theo came at least once a day. Rory napped until she heard his soft knocks on the door. They were distinct, like his voice. She'd come to recognize these little details. "Can I come in?" Always he asked, and always she said, "Please do." His white coat was perfectly neat, as always. "Are you sleeping better?" Rory didn't think she'd process the interrogation in a normal way. Not that she had any idea of what normal was. Theo had seemed concerned about how well she'd handled it all. Truth was, Rory just had to survive. Feeling would come later when she was safe. Those instincts drove her even more than her desperation to recover her memories and figure out what she was doing here. "I slept well last night." She scooted down the bench so he could sit beside her. "You don't have a list of topics today." He chuckled. "No. I thought we'd have a break from the notes. You can't resist asking me all the questions you think up every night, trying to control myself here. Although I do think of more to ask you every day." He shrugged, smile so sweet that it was charming. "You are the only alien I've ever met. Or time traveler." A nod. "I've considered that." "Oh, you have new theories?" "Always new theories. Most are stupid, though. Same for me. I can only guess at my life. It's really sad. If we could figure out what caused your amnesia, or how the craft you came in works, it seems like it is just a shell. There's no computer, nothing mechanical apart from the door. I think something else transported you and it just carried you, but it's not my area of expertise." Rory watched him. "You didn't bring your notes, but this is still an interview." "No, it's not, really. I don't have an agenda today. You always have an agenda. It's fine. You can't help yourself." "What do you mean? You're a scientist. You can't help but dissect me, even through normal conversation." He shifted, expression tightening. "I don't want you to feel that way." "Why not?" "It's not my personality that makes me fascinating, Theo." "That's not true." Rory sighed and leaned back on her arms. "As long as I'm here, I'll be a lab rat. There's no escaping that. It's nice to have some scientists who actually like their rats." Theo stood and paced a few steps before facing her again. Interesting how put together he always seemed until suddenly he wasn't. He wasn't the best at covering his emotions. "Stop insulting yourself. Stop insulting me." Her brows raised. "I've insulted you?" "Yes. You said Christine and I were your friends. Now you're a rat? And I'm just some cold-blooded scientist experimenting on you?" Maybe her tone had been a little more jaded than she'd realized. "Sorry. I'm just frustrated. I guess. I don't ever really know how I feel. I try not to think about it. Maybe you should. Maybe you need to connect with your emotions more. Not just to try remembering your old life, but to be healthy." "Are we doing therapy now too?" He groaned and sat back down, though not as close as before. "I didn't mean to make you feel like you're a subject. You're a person." His voice quieted, and he glanced at her before returning his stare to his feet. "I care about you." Rory bit her lip. He was shy, wasn't he? Shy because he was being honest about his emotions, or shy because of her? "I won't question it again. I didn't mean to do that in the first place." He looked up at her. "I do have some questions that kept me up last night, though. I knew it was coming. You can't resist." "Just a few." He turned to face her. "Okay. I'll say a few terms, and you tell me the first word that comes to mind. It has to be the first, all right?" Rory sat back against the wall and drew her knees up. "All right." Time passed quicker with Theo than it did with anyone else, and she wished it worked the opposite, because she'd rather that he never left. Theo's knock came at the door later that night when he shouldn't have been back until the next day. Was it him? It was. He always knocked 4 times. The first 2 softer than the last. "Theo?" Rory set the paintbrush she'd been using down beside her palette. He opened the door a crack, an aberration from his usual. "Can I come in? Sorry for dropping by." "Yeah. Is everything okay?" Her eyes widened as he walked in, holding a guitar. "What are you doing?" I kept thinking after we talked. "It isn't fair for you to be the only one humiliated. You're always watched and poked and interrogated. I haven't been considerate enough." He sat down on the bench by the window, looking at her for a moment before laughing quietly. "Prepare yourself." "Theo." He strummed, his fingers deft as they danced across the neck of the guitar, the sounds beautiful enough to clash with his self-conscious smile. "Rory." He chuckled softly as he sang. "Forgive me." "No." She covered her eyes with both hands and dropped down onto the bench. "Oh, you really don't have to do this." "Rory." He sang louder. "Forgive me. Theo, stop. You're not a rat. You really don't have to do this. You're human. Human, Rory, the human. And I'm so sorry. Rory shook her head. Great voice. Great instrumentals. Fucking horrible lyrics. They're bad, Theo. Human. Theo strummed harder, singing louder. You really don't have to spell it again. Rory, the human. He lowered the guitar and smiled. Have I embarrassed myself enough? She covered her mouth, biting her lips. Oh, you need more? No. She laughed and lowered her hand. I don't think I can take more. You have thoroughly embarrassed yourself. I probably need to work on the song a little more for next time. Rory caught his eyes, stomach fluttering. He was a quiet kind of handsome, a quiet kind of funny, but loud in his kindness. I forgive you, Theo. Not that there was anything to forgive in the first place. There's a lot you've forgiven. Someone should offer you an apology. What else can I expect? I'm a threat. You're a person. The thudding of the heart filled in the quiet that followed. Are most people like you? Kind and trusting? I like to think so. But I have been called an optimist. His brows pinched then as his eyes dropped her hands. Have you been painting? Oh. Rory nodded at the window. I'm working on something. She moved to the window where brushstrokes of violet covered the blue sky outside. Is that the sky? Yes. It looks right to me. She rubbed her arm. I kept trying colors until it did. The violet covering the sky made her stomach light. This feels like home. That's incredible. His stare switched from the window to her. We could do a functional MRI to see which parts of your brain you're using when you do this. Prove whether it's a memory. I thought your imaging showed I'm having procedural memories and things like that. This is different. I think this is like the song you sang. It's an actual memory. Her throat tightened at the mention of the song. Why didn't you want to do tests while I sang the song before? It seemed cruel. Clearly it's a source of pain. I decided not to pursue it. Even then he'd cared. Theo. She walked to the window, looking at her violet sky. The camera was behind her. If she spoke softly, they probably wouldn't hear her. There's something I haven't told anyone. He moved beside her, tapping the tacky drying paint like he was just inspecting her work. What is it? I swear this is the only thing I haven't mentioned. Say it already. Rory swallowed hard. I know how to use guns. I know how to use your guns. An M16. She watched the change in his expression as he processed the information. Why would I know anything about guns from Earth or how to use them? Never tell anyone. Theo's voice was tight. Never. Her eyes widened. She tried to speak, but nothing came out. I'm serious, Rory, but what if it could help keep this world safe? Unbridled panic never kept anyone safe. No good will come of this, not unless you have answers. He eased closer, voice low. Rory, there's no hope of you ever having a life if they find out you've trained with our weapons. Guilt pricked her for keeping it a secret. I'll never have a life anyway. That's not true. There's always hope. If you keep helping us, it's only natural they'll favor you. They won't be able to help it if you make them care about you. Her breath caught at the tenderness of his voice. You actually do trust me. Why? You're a good person. It wasn't the first time they'd gotten close. This time felt different still. His eyes didn't leave hers. You deserve better than this, he whispered. You've lost everything. You can't lose your hope for a future too. There's only one reason to train with guns. I have to say something eventually. There's two reasons. One is to attack. The other is to defend. He picked at the violet residue on his finger. Only you can say which of those you want to do. Others like me will have the same knowledge and skill set. The military is already preparing for that. They assume that if you know enough about Earth to have mastered English and Mandarin, that your people could have mastered much more. I'm trusting you, so you trust me too. Tell no one. She started to speak again when a sudden knock on the door made her jump. Did someone see them talking quietly? Had she gotten Theo in trouble? It's urgent. That voice. It sounded like one of the general's advisors. Rory rushed to the door and opened it wide. What is it? The woman swallowed hard enough for her to hear. I need to show you. She rushed down the hall with the woman, Theo following closely behind. Then they entered a room Rory hadn't seen before, one with monitors lining the wall. The general stood with his arms crossed, staring at a screen. Lights flickered as the camera shifted from a reporter Rory had never seen to someone who made her breath catch. Dr. Christine Johansson. Her friend spoke confidently on the screen. I did not come to the decision to share this news with the world lightly. Theo moved beside Rory. Her voice trembled as she whispered to him. What have you guys done? Dr. Johansson spoke on the screen, voice clear. The world deserves to know the truth. Theo breathed out through pursed lips. Solemn. It wasn't me. The general turned to Rory. Did you know about this? No. He slammed his fist against the table. Damn it. Dr. Johansson continued to talk, spilling secrets that Rory knew would land the woman in prison for a very long time. And the small world that had become Rory's in the past 7 weeks blew up on the spot. She couldn't imagine what this new future held.